Welcome to my channel, and today I want to share a story that reveals the hidden power behind emotions we often misunderstand. A story about a young man whose quick temper and intense heart made him feel isolated for years, but through self-discovery, love, and understanding, he learns how to turn anger into strength, fear into courage, and passion into connection. The story is about the journey of realizing that the very traits people often judge us for, anger, honesty, and deep care, can actually be the keys to healing, meaningful relationships, and living a truly authentic life. There was a young man named Ethan Warren, someone who carried a heart so sincere and unfiltered that the world never quite knew what to do with him, and for most of his life, he struggled with a problem that everyone around him misunderstood: his temper. Ethan was the kind of person who felt everything deeply, a little too deeply perhaps, because inside him there existed a sensitivity that no one could see, a tenderness that he never spoke about, and a longing to protect the people he cared about, even if he didn't always know how to express it in the gentlest way. From the outside, he looked strong, stubborn, quick to flare up, and ready to snap at anyone who pushed the wrong button. But within him lived a truth that he himself didn't fully understand until many years later. Ethan had grown up in a small town in Oregon, the sort of place where everyone claimed to know everyone, where people smiled politely, yet kept silent judgments tucked behind their eyes, and where emotions like his were often labeled as immaturity or rudeness. His mother, Marilyn Warren, used to tell him that he carried a fire heart, a heart that burned too brightly, too intensely, and that the flames sometimes escaped before he could hold them back. But Ethan never thought of himself as special. He simply felt things stronger than others, and when he was hurt, disappointed, or misunderstood, that hurt erupted as anger because it was easier to explode than to let himself break. From childhood, Ethan's intentions had always been good. He was the boy who defended his classmates when they were bullied, the one who gave away his lunch. If someone else forgot theirs, the one who would walk a friend home in the rain, even if it meant soaking himself to the bone. Yet the same friends who benefited from his kindness often whispered behind his back that he had anger issues, that he took everything too seriously, that he didn't know how to relax or laugh things off. His teachers called him argumentative, even when all he wanted to do was stand up for what he believed was right. His father, Greg Warren, a quiet man who rarely expressed emotion, never understood why his son reacted so passionately to everything, and the tension between them only intensified as Ethan got older. Greg preferred silence, while Ethan needed truth, unfiltered, clear, honest truth. And because of that, the two often clashed. When Ethan felt unloved or unheard, he raised his voice. When Greg felt disrespected, he withdrew, leaving Ethan even more confused and frustrated. And so slowly, the world taught Ethan a painful lesson: that people feared emotions they didn't understand, that honesty sounded like aggression to those who preferred comforting lies, and that love often disguised itself as anger when the heart did not know any other way to protect what mattered. As he reached adulthood, Ethan realized he possessed three qualities that defined him more than anything else. Three qualities that shaped every relationship he ever had, though he didn't recognize their importance until life forced him to confront them. The first quality was his pure, honest heart. Ethan cared in ways most people no longer cared in modern times. He cared fiercely, selflessly, instinctively. If he loved you, he would go to war for you, even if you never asked. He would stay up all night talking you through a heartbreak, fix your car at midnight, lend money he didn't have, defend you when you weren't around, and protect you even from yourself. But people rarely interpreted his actions correctly. Many mistook his intensity for pride, his protectiveness for control, and his anger for arrogance. They didn't see that his temper surfaced most when he felt betrayed or dismissed, when he sensed lies, or when he felt someone he cared for slipping away. To Ethan, anger wasn't about dominance, it was about heartbreak. Each flare-up was a crack in the armor around a heart that had already been wounded too many times. The second defining quality was Ethan's inability to tolerate lies. He despised dishonesty with a passion that bordered on brutal righteousness. From a young age, he learned the hard way that lies destroy trust faster than anything else. Because when he was 10 years old, his best friend Caleb blamed him for a broken window to avoid getting in trouble. Ethan hadn't done it, yet the adults punished him anyway because Caleb lied convincingly. And the sting of that unfairness dug its way into Ethan's spirit so deeply that he never forgot it. Since that day, he vowed he would never let lies control his life, not from others, and not from himself. And so Ethan spoke truthfully, directly, sometimes harshly, always clearly. He couldn't sugarcoat his feelings, couldn't pretend to be okay when he wasn't, couldn't smile politely when something felt wrong. Some people admired this honesty, calling him refreshing, real, trustworthy. But many others despised it because truth, when spoken plainly, can feel like a slap. They complained that he lacked tact, that he hurt their feelings, that he didn't know how to just let things go. But Ethan never intended to harm anyone. He simply valued truth more than temporary comfort. He believed truth healed, even if it stung at first. But the third quality, the one that surprised even Ethan, was the most important. His anger was another form of love. He didn't get angry at strangers. He didn't lash out at people he didn't care about. His temper was reserved almost exclusively for the people he loved deeply. His mother, his father, his girlfriend Emily Carter, his closest friends, and even his younger sister Lily. When he feared losing them, his emotions grew too big for his body to contain, and anger became the shield he used to mask the panic building inside him. Every raise of his voice was a plea not to be abandoned. Every frustrated gesture was a sign of how afraid he was of being misunderstood, replaced, or forgotten. But the people around him rarely saw the fear behind his reactions. They saw only the heat, never the hurt. They saw the fire, not the trembling hands trying to keep it controlled. Emily, the woman he loved more than anyone, often told him that he scared her when he yelled, even though he never once raised a hand to her or would ever dream of hurting her. She didn't understand that the louder he got, the more terrified he was of losing her. The more desperately he needed reassurance that she wasn't slipping away. Over the years, this misunderstanding took a toll on Ethan's relationships. Friends drifted away, teachers labeled him difficult. Co-workers whispered that he had a temper problem. Even Emily, despite loving him deeply, began to doubt whether she could handle someone so emotionally intense. Ethan tried to change, tried to hold his anger inside, tried to stay quiet when something hurt him, but all that did was eat at him from the inside out. The more he bottled up, the more explosive the eventual outburst became. He didn't realize that his real challenge wasn't controlling his emotions. It was learning how to express them in a way that others could understand without fearing him. One day, everything changed when Ethan met an older man named Robert Hayes, a retired psychologist who volunteered at a community center where Ethan occasionally helped with youth programs. Robert had a calm presence, the kind that made you feel safe just by being near him. And he took an interest in Ethan after noticing the way he interacted with the kids, gentle, protective patient, so different from the fiery, defensive young man many adults described. One evening, after witnessing Ethan lose his temper during a disagreement with another volunteer, Robert approached him and simply asked, "Who hurt you first?" That question, simple yet piercing, stunned Ethan into silence. No one had ever asked him that before. People had scolded him, judged him, lectured him, but no one had ever looked past the anger to see the wound underneath. And for the first time, Ethan began telling his story out loud. His frustrations, his fears, his heartbreaks, the loneliness that followed him even in crowds, the guilt he carried every time someone walked away because they misunderstood him. Robert listened patiently, never interrupting, never judging. And when Ethan finally ran out of words, Robert smiled gently and said, "Your anger is not the problem. Your silence is." That sentence unlocked something inside Ethan. Robert explained to him that people like him, people with pure hearts, who despise lies, who love deeply and fear losing the people they care about, often express emotional pain in the form of anger because they were never taught how to use softer words for deeper wounds. "You're not broken," Robert said. "You just feel more than most people do, and that is not a flaw, it's a gift. But you need to learn how to show the love behind the anger, or people will only see the fire, not the warmth." This conversation became the turning point of Ethan's life. The moment he began understanding himself not as a flawed, hot-tempered man, but as someone whose emotional intensity came from a place of purity, honesty, and love. He realized he wasn't angry because he hated people. He was angry because he cared too much. He wasn't loud because he wanted to overpower anyone. He was loud because he feared losing them. His entire identity shifted when he understood that most people misread him because they didn't know his heart as deeply as he did. And so Ethan began working on himself, slowly, patiently, intentionally. Not to change who he was, but to express who he was more clearly. This is where Ethan's real journey begins. Ethan's transformation didn't happen overnight because change never arrives quickly for people who have spent their entire lives being misunderstood. And for someone like Ethan, who felt emotions at a level most people couldn't begin to imagine. Learning to communicate without erupting was like learning to breathe in a new language. After his conversation with Robert Hayes, he spent several weeks reflecting, silently replaying old moments in his mind. Moments where he had reacted too sharply. Moments where he had raised his voice because he felt cornered. Moments where someone walked away because they saw only the flames of his frustration and not the trembling soul behind it. He thought about his girlfriend, Emily Carter, soft-spoken, patient, loving Emily, whose eyes sometimes filled with tears when his voice trembled with anger, born from fear, not hatred. He remembered the way she would quietly ask, "Why are you yelling?" And how he could never explain that his anger had nothing to do with her doing something wrong and everything to do with him feeling terrified that something between them might be slipping through his fingers. He remembered his father, Greg, how their arguments always ended with his father walking away, leaving Ethan feeling abandoned by silence, which was a deeper wound than any sharp word. He remembered moments at school and work, the times he tried to protect someone and was accused of being aggressive, the times he spoke the truth and people accused him of being harsh, the times he tried to fix a problem but ended up being labeled the problem. Each memory weighed heavily on him, yet for the first time, he didn't see himself as the villain in those stories. He saw a scared, sensitive boy who had never learned the language of vulnerability. And that realization hurt more than any misunderstanding ever had, because it meant that his anger wasn't a failure of character, it was a failure of emotional education. So Ethan began practicing something he had never done before, slowing down his reactions. It felt unnatural, almost painful, because every fiber of his being wanted to respond instantly, to defend himself instantly, to correct misunderstandings instantly. But he forced himself to pause, breathe, and think before the fire reached his voice. Robert taught him something simple, yet powerful. Name your feeling before your anger names it for you. At first, Ethan didn't understand the concept, but with practice, he realized how often his anger was not actually anger but fear, disappointment, confusion, or sadness. When Emily forgot a promise she made, his first instinct used to be frustration. But now he asked himself, am I angry because she forgot, or am I hurt because it made me feel unimportant? When his father dismissed his concerns with silence, Ethan would normally flare up instantly, but now he recognized the ache beneath it, the ache of wanting to be understood, wanting connection. These realizations softened him, not in weakness, but in strength, because understanding the truth of your own emotions is the first step toward mastering them. Still, even with this progress, life refused to make things easy for him, because growth is always tested, especially in people who feel deeply. One afternoon, Ethan and Emily faced one of the most difficult moments of their relationship. She had come to visit him after work, her face tired, her voice soft, and he immediately sensed something was wrong. Emily wasn't someone who hid her emotions well, even though she tried, and Ethan, being as intuitive as he was reactive, felt her sadness before she even spoke. She sat on the edge of his bed, twisting her hands together, avoiding his eyes. "Ethan," she whispered, "I need to tell you something." His stomach tightened instantly, panic crawling up his chest, because he always feared bad news, always feared losing the people he loved most. "What happened?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She took a breath, then said, "I talked to my sister today and she said she thinks you get too angry, and she doesn't understand why I'm with someone who scares me sometimes." Her words pierced him like glass, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. He swallowed hard, felt the fire spark inside him, felt the instinct to defend himself rise, felt the old reflex of saying, "You don't understand," ready to burst out. But for the first time in his life, he fought the instinct. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and forced his voice to soften. "Do I scare you?" he asked gently. Emily looked up, tears forming. "Not because I think you'd hurt me," she said. "I trust you more than anyone. It's just, when you get angry, I can't see your heart anymore. I only hear your voice get louder, and I feel like I'm disappearing in that moment." Her words broke him open. He felt the guilt, the fear, the sadness all at once overwhelming him so completely that he sat beside her in silence, trying to assemble the right words in a mind that had only ever known how to react, not communicate. After a long pause, he took her hand, gently, carefully, as if she were made of glass, and said, "Emily, I'm not angry at you. I'm scared. I get loud because I feel like I'm losing control of the situation, like I'm losing the person I love. But the last thing I ever want is to make you feel unsafe. You're the only peace I have." Emily's tears fell freely then, not because she was hurt, but because she finally saw the truth he never knew how to express. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her tighter than he ever had before, as if shielding her from the world and himself. And in that moment, Ethan understood something profound. Love isn't just about protecting others, it's about protecting the relationship from the parts of yourself you haven't yet learned how to control. Determined to improve, Ethan began attending weekly sessions with Robert, learning tools that helped him translate his emotions into words instead of heat. He practiced speaking with calm honesty, practiced expressing fear without wrapping it in anger, practiced admitting when he was hurt without masking it behind frustration. And slowly, he began to see changes in the people around him. His co-workers noticed he listened more before responding. His sister, Lily, joked that he was becoming a monk with an attitude. His mother hugged him and whispered, "I'm proud of you, baby." Words she hadn't said in years, but the biggest change was with his father. One evening after a minor disagreement, Ethan took a deep breath and said, "Dad, I'm not yelling. I'm trying to tell you how I feel. When you walk away, it makes me feel like what I'm saying doesn't matter." Greg froze, stunned. He had never heard Ethan express hurt without anger. For a moment, neither spoke, but then Greg sat down, looked at his son, and said quietly, "I never walked away because I didn't care. I walked away because I didn't know how to handle so much emotion." That confession broke down a wall between them that had stood for decades, and for the first time, they talked, really talked. Not as father and son trapped in a cycle of silence and frustration, but as two men trying to understand each other. Yet despite all of this progress, Ethan still carried the weight of his past misunderstandings. The sting of people calling him arrogant, aggressive, overreactive. He thought often about individuals like him, individuals with honest hearts, individuals who despise lies, individuals whose anger is tied to love. And he realized that the world rarely sees them clearly. People like Ethan are judged by their volume, not their vulnerability, by their reaction, not their reasoning. And it made him wonder how many others lived their lives feeling misunderstood, punished for caring too deeply, shamed for loving too intensely. The thought lingered in him, growing stronger each day, until one morning he woke up with a sudden idea that felt as if it came from something bigger than himself. He decided he wanted to share what he had learned, not through lectures, not through arguments, not through theories, but through a story, his story, transformed not into a confession of flaws, but into a message of hope for anyone who ever felt like anger made them unlovable. And this decision, this quiet, determined spark, would change his life in ways he never expected. Ethan didn't know where to begin with the idea forming in his mind, but he knew he wanted to reach people who felt like him, people who carried too much emotion in a world that demanded numbness, people who were told they were too sensitive, too honest, too fiery, when really they were just too human. He started writing late at night, long after everyone else fell asleep, sitting at his desk, with a dim lamp illuminating stacks of paper, his laptop, and an untouched cup of coffee that always grew cold before he remembered to drink it. He wrote about his childhood, about the moments that shaped his temper, About the times he tried to defend others and was blamed instead. About the countless misunderstandings that followed him through school, friendships, and love. But he also wrote about the beauty of feeling intensely, the loyalty that came with it, the passion, the protectiveness, the honesty. As he wrote, he realized his experiences weren't weaknesses. They were strengths that had been misinterpreted by people who didn't know how to read the language of his heart. What began as a few sentences turned into pages, and pages turned into chapters, each one peeling back another layer of the boy who became a man misunderstood by many, but deeply loved by those who took the time to see beyond his fire. Emily supported him wholeheartedly, sitting on the floor beside him as he typed, offering quiet encouragement, reading sections aloud, and even wiping tears from her eyes when she reached parts that cut too close to her own memories. "You're helping people without even knowing it," she whispered one night, resting her head on his knee. Ethan brushed a hand through her hair and smiled softly. "I just want people like me to know they're not alone," he said, and he meant it. While writing gave Ethan a sense of purpose, it also forced him to confront emotions he had buried for years. Reliving past moments stirred old pain, and sometimes he found himself overwhelmed, not with anger, but with sadness for the boy he once was, the boy who felt unloved simply because he felt too much. Robert Hayes continued guiding him through these emotional storms, reminding him that healing often requires revisiting old wounds so they can close properly instead of forming scars that split open later. "Your anger was always the echo of something deeper," Robert told him. "Now you're learning to listen to the echo instead of shouting over it." This wisdom settled in Ethan's heart, making him feel lighter than he had in years. But despite his progress, the world still had ways of testing him. One day, at work, a co-worker named Jason Miller, who had always disliked Ethan's straightforward nature, made a snide comment about his attitude problems. Ethan felt the familiar heat rise inside him, the instinct to snap back, to defend himself sharply. But he closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and chose a different path. "I'm not here to argue with you," he said calmly. "If you have a problem with me, talk to me directly instead of talking at me." Jason was stunned into silence, and several other co-workers stared at Ethan as though they were witnessing something impossible. And in a way, they were. Ethan was breaking a lifelong pattern in real time. His journey toward emotional mastery wasn't linear. Some days he succeeded beautifully, and other days he slipped back into old habits. But each slip taught him something new. Emily noticed the changes and cherished them, though she never demanded perfection. She loved Ethan not because he was flawless, but because he was trying, truly trying, to become the best version of himself without losing the passionate, protective heart she fell in love with. Still, there were moments where she struggled too. One evening, they had a small disagreement about something trivial, a forgotten text message, a cancelled plan. And although Ethan remained calm, Emily unexpectedly burst into tears. When he asked what was wrong, she admitted she had been afraid that if she expressed her frustration, he might react with anger, like he used to. That confession shattered Ethan's heart. He gently pulled her close and whispered, "Emily, I'm never going to be perfect. I'll stumble, I'll learn, I'll grow. But I need you to know that you never have to be afraid of me. I love you too much to let my past shape your fear." Emily buried her face into his chest, and the two held each other for a long, quiet moment, both silently promising to keep choosing understanding over fear. As Ethan continued writing his story, something unexpected happened. His words began spreading online. Emily had shared a short excerpt on social media, a small portion where Ethan described how anger often hides a broken heart, and within hours it was being reshared by thousands, then tens of thousands. People from all over the country commented things like, "This is me. I feel seen for the first time. I thought I was the only one like this, and I wish someone understood me the way this describes." Ethan was stunned. He had written these words for healing, not for attention, and certainly not for fame. Yet the world had found something in his story that resonated deeply. Even Robert smiled when Ethan told him. "You see," he said, "your fire wasn't meant to burn people. It was meant to light the way for them." Those words stayed with Ethan. For the first time in his life, He felt like his pain had a purpose, like his struggles were more than obstacles. They were lessons meant to be shared. And so he kept writing, pouring his soul into every sentence, determined to finish what he had started. However, just as life often does when things begin to go well, something happened that threatened to undo all of Ethan's progress. One afternoon, he received a call from his mother's neighbor. Marilyn had fainted in her kitchen. Ethan rushed to her house, panic clawing at him as he drove, every worst-case scenario flashing through his mind. He found her sitting on the couch, pale but awake, insisting she was fine even though her hands trembled. The doctor diagnosed her with exhaustion and stress, urging her to rest. Taking care of her became Ethan's priority, and yet, despite his love for her, the fear of losing her stirred emotions he hadn't felt in months. When she refused his help one evening, insisting she could handle things alone, Ethan felt his old frustration flare up. His voice rose before he could stop it, fueled not by anger, but by terror at the thought of losing the woman who had been his anchor his whole life. Marilyn looked at him with a mixture of love and sadness. "You yell because you're scared," she whispered. "But baby, you don't have to protect me from everything. Let me be your mother too." Her words broke his defenses instantly, and he sank into a chair, breathing heavily, tears burning his eyes. He realized then how deeply his fear of loss controlled him, how it still clawed at his heart despite all the progress he had made. But instead of spiraling backward, Ethan chose to confront this fear head-on. He talked to Robert about it, admitted how terrified he had felt, how quickly the old anger had risen. Robert reassured him that healing doesn't erase emotion. It teaches you how to navigate it. "You didn't fail," he said gently. "You reacted as someone who loves deeply. The difference now is that you recognize the feeling behind the anger. That's growth." Encouraged, Ethan apologized to his mother, explaining his fear rather than hiding behind irritation. She hugged him tightly, grateful not for his perfection, but for his willingness to be vulnerable. While caring for Marilyn, writing his story, nurturing his relationship with Emily, and continuing therapy, Ethan found himself changing in ways he never expected. He discovered patience he didn't know he had, empathy he didn't know he was capable of expressing, and self-awareness that softened the fire inside him without extinguishing it. Slowly, the boy with the misunderstood temper was becoming a man with emotional intelligence, a man capable of translating his heart into words rather than volume. But the most surprising transformation of all was this. He no longer hated his anger. He no longer saw it as a flaw that needed to be erased. For the first time, he understood that anger, when healthy and guided, was simply passion seeking direction. It was love wearing armor. It was fear holding out its hands, begging not to be left alone, and understanding that truth allowed Ethan to embrace parts of himself he had spent years trying to hide. But life still had one more major test waiting for him, a test that would push him farther than anything before, a test that would determine the kind of man he would become. The test came unexpectedly, as life's hardest lessons often do, arriving on a day that began like any other. With sunlight filtering through the blinds of Ethan's bedroom and the faint smell of coffee drifting in from the kitchen where his mother was trying, against Dr. S. orders, to resume her normal routine. Ethan had woken early to check on her before heading to work. But when he entered the kitchen, Marilyn swayed slightly, gripping the counter for balance, her face paling again. Fear surged through him instantly, the old familiar terror that wrapped its fingers around his heart and squeezed until he could barely breathe. "Mom, sit down," he urged, guiding her to a chair, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. He wanted to shout, demand that she stop trying to act strong, but he caught himself, forced his voice to steady. She smiled weakly, brushing off the moment as nothing more than fatigue. But Ethan saw the truth in her shaking hands. He called Emily, asking her to stay with his mother while he worked, and Emily agreed without hesitation, arriving with a calm presence that soothed Marilyn more than any doctor could. As Ethan drove to his job, his mind churned with worry. He hated feeling helpless, hated the idea that he couldn't control or prevent something from happening to the people he loved. This fear had always been the root of his anger, and now it pulsed inside him like a warning siren. When he arrived at work, he tried to focus, but his thoughts drifted constantly to his mother. Jason, the co-worker who had always targeted him, noticed his distraction and made yet another sarcastic comment in front of their team. Normally, Ethan would have ignored him or handled the situation with calm assertiveness, but today his emotions were already on a knife's edge. Still, he took a breath, remembering everything he had learned, and responded with a steady voice. "Jason, I'm going through something personal. Please give me some space today." That should have been enough, but Jason sneered, muttering something about Ethan being dramatic as always, and something inside Ethan snapped, but not in the old way. Instead of shouting, instead of reacting harshly, he felt a deep, controlled fire rise within him. He stepped closer, looked Jason directly in the eyes, and said quietly, "I've spent my whole life being misunderstood because of my emotions. I'm not letting you make me feel small today." The room went silent. Jason's smirk disappeared. And for the first time, Ethan felt strong, not because he yelled, but because he didn't need to. His calmness carried more weight than his anger ever had. Later that afternoon, Ethan received another call, this time from the hospital. Emily's voice trembled as she explained that Marilyn had fainted again and the doctors wanted to keep her overnight. Ethan rushed there immediately, pushing through the hospital's sterile hallways until he reached his mother's room, where Emily sat beside her bed holding her hand. Marilyn looked fragile, smaller somehow, and the sight ignited both fear and tenderness inside him. He sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, whispering, "I'm here, Mom." She opened her eyes slowly, giving him a tired smile. "I know, baby," she whispered. "You always are." Her voice cracked, and something in Ethan's chest cracked with it. He felt guilt, fear, love, all tangled together, and for a moment he thought the old anger might resurface because the emotions were so overwhelming. But instead of exploding, he let tears fall, for once allowing himself to feel openly rather than defensively. Emily gently touched his shoulder, grounding him as he leaned forward and kissed his mother's hand. That night, as Marilyn slept, Ethan walked down the quiet hallway with Emily. He felt vulnerable, raw, and afraid, and Emily slipped her fingers through his, offering silent comfort. "I hate this," he whispered. "I hate feeling like I can't protect the people I love." Emily squeezed his hand. "You don't have to protect everyone," she said softly. "You just have to be there. That's enough." Ethan shook his head. "It never feels like enough." Emily stepped in front of him, placing her hands on his chest. "Ethan, listen to me. Your love isn't defined by how much you can control. It's defined by how deeply you care. You don't have to be anyone's shield. You just have to be their heart." Her words struck him harder than she knew, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing in her calmness, letting her words settle inside him like gentle rain on a wildfire. The next day, the doctors diagnosed Marilyn with a heart condition that required long-term treatment, but was manageable with medication and rest. Relief washed over Ethan, though the fear still lingered beneath the surface. He promised himself to be patient with her, to express his concerns gently rather than forcefully, and to trust that caring did not mean controlling. He realized that love, real love, required letting people be human, imperfect and vulnerable, just as he was learning to be. Over the following weeks, Ethan balanced work, writing, therapy sessions, and caring for his mother. Emily supported him at every step, becoming his grounding force, his reminder that love could be expressed softly without losing its strength. Meanwhile, the story Ethan was writing continued spreading online, reaching people far beyond his small town. Strangers messaged him, sharing their own experiences with misunderstood anger, with loving too intensely, with suffering silently, because no one saw the truth behind their reactions. Some wrote about losing relationships because their anger hid their brokenness. Others described childhood wounds they had never healed. Many said they cried reading his words because they finally felt recognized. Ethan read every message, feeling both humbled and overwhelmed. He had never intended to touch so many lives, but now that he had, he felt a responsibility to finish the story with honesty and hope. Just when life seemed to steady again, an unexpected event forced Ethan to confront one of the deepest fears he carried: the possibility of losing the person he loved most. One evening, after a difficult day caring for his mother, he arrived at Emily's apartment to find her pacing anxiously. She had been offered a major career opportunity in another state, a once-in-a-lifetime chance she had dreamed about for years. But she had not told him earlier because she feared how he might react. When she finally explained, Ethan's heart froze. The instinctive fear of abandonment rose instantly, threatening to swallow him. His breath quickened, the old fire flickered in his chest, and for a moment he felt the pull of old habits, the urge to say something sharp, to accuse her of hiding things, to assume the worst. But instead he sat down slowly, pressing his palms against his knees to keep them steady. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. Emily's voice shook. "Because I didn't want you to think I was leaving you." His heart broke at that. Not because she might go, but because she believed he would interpret her dream as betrayal. "Emily," he whispered, "I love you. And I'm scared, really scared. But your dreams aren't a threat to me. I need time to process this. Can you give me that?" Emily nodded tearfully, collapsing into his arms. And that night, they talked, really talked, for hours, discussing fears, hopes, boundaries, and possibilities, using vulnerability instead of anger, compassion instead of defensiveness. For Ethan, this conversation was another turning point. He realized that the truest form of love wasn't possession, it was support, even when it hurt. He told Emily that he didn't want her to give up her dreams for him, but he also asked her to include him in her decisions, to trust that he could handle the discomfort without exploding, that he was no longer the man who let fear decide his reactions. Emily promised she would, and the two held each other through the night, exhausted but connected more deeply than ever before. This new test revealed something unexpected in Ethan. He had grown into a man capable of facing fear without letting it transform into anger. He had learned to pause, to breathe, to choose softness even when his heart trembled. And slowly he realized he was no longer living in reaction. He was living with intention. But the biggest change of all was still on the horizon, something that would reshape not only Ethan's life, but the lives of everyone his story reached. As the weeks rolled forward and the cold evenings settled deeper into the streets of their small American town, Ethan found himself waking each morning with a strange mixture of heaviness and hope, feeling as if every sunrise was nudging him toward a version of himself he had avoided for far too long. And Lauren, though still bruised by the emotional storms they had both weathered, slowly began to sense that something inside him was shifting in a way she had secretly prayed for. She watched him sit with Daniel during late-night conversations. Instead of shutting down the moment tension appeared, watched him bite back the sharp reactions that once came out without warning, watched him choose to think before speaking. Not because someone demanded it, but because he finally understood how deeply his unguarded anger had cut the very people he cared for the most. And one chilly Friday evening, as the three of them sat on the back porch, surrounded by the soft hum of neighborhood life, Ethan finally spoke the words that had been building inside him, telling them both that he now realized how anger had always been his shield, a way to protect a heart that felt things too strongly, a heart that cared so deeply it sometimes scared him. And Lauren reached over and covered his hand with hers, reminding him that people who feel intensely are not broken. They are just brave enough to love without filters. And Daniel nodded with the kind of pride only a lifelong friend could hold, pointing out that none of them ever wanted Ethan to stop being passionate, they just wanted him to stop hurting himself in the process. And as a quiet moment settled between them, Ethan admitted that what frightened him most was the possibility of losing the people who mattered, which was exactly why he reacted the way he did. But Daniel gently explained that real love doesn't disappear. When someone tries to grow it, only gets stronger. And Lauren added that anger rooted in fear could be softened with honesty, patience, and the willingness to trust that people who love you won't just walk away. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan truly believed that change didn't mean losing himself. Change simply meant learning how to carry his heart without letting it explode every time it felt threatened. And as they all sat there sharing the quiet comfort of understanding and new beginnings, Ethan felt something inside him settle. Not in the way anger used to settle like a storm waiting to strike, but in a way that felt grounding, gentle, and steady. As if life was finally offering him the peace he had chased for years without knowing how to claim it. And with the night air brushing softly against their shoulders, he took a deep breath and silently promised himself that he would continue this journey. Not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely. Because for the first time he wasn't fighting to protect his heart from others. He was learning how to protect the love inside it so he wouldn't push away the very people who had always stood by him. As the days drifted into a calmer rhythm, Ethan began noticing the subtle transformations within himself. Small shifts that no one would have believed possible months earlier, like the way he now paused before reacting, feeling the rush of emotion, but choosing to redirect it rather than unleashing it. And though the effort sometimes exhausted him, there was a growing sense of pride, a quiet awareness that he was no longer trapped inside his old patterns. And Lauren sensed this too. She watched him with the kind of admiration that comes from witnessing someone rebuild themselves piece by piece, not out of fear of losing others, but out of a newfound desire to live with clarity and peace. And Daniel, ever the supportive friend, made it a point to remind Ethan that progress didn't require perfection, that the strength of a person wasn't measured by how few mistakes they made, but by how courageously they faced the moments when their flaws tried to take control. And one evening, after a long day at work, filled with unexpected tension and a few temptations to slip back into old habits, Ethan sat alone in his living room with the lights dimmed, realizing that growth wasn't a single moment of breakthrough, but dozens of quiet, unseen battles he fought within himself. Battles that no one applauded him for, but that shaped him in ways he could finally understand. And as he leaned back against the couch, he recalled something Lauren had said earlier that week, that people with tender hearts often disguise their softness with fire because they fear their vulnerability will be used against them. And those words settled in him like a truth he had needed for years, helping him recognize that his anger had never been the enemy. The real enemy had been his fear of being misunderstood, unloved, or abandoned. And with that realization came a wave of clarity he couldn't ignore. A recognition that the people who truly cared never demanded he hide his emotions. They only wanted him to learn how to express them without cutting himself or them in the process. And as the quiet of the house wrapped around him, Ethan finally allowed himself to imagine a future where his heart wasn't something to defend, but something to share. Where the honesty he valued so deeply didn't have to come out like a blade, but could instead be spoken with patience, empathy, and intention. And when Lauren eventually joined him, sitting beside him without needing to ask what he was thinking, Ethan turned to her with a softness she had long hoped to see, telling her that for the first time in his life, he felt like he was stepping into who he was meant to be. Someone who could care fiercely without losing control. Someone who could love deeply without letting fear turn that love into anger. Someone who could finally believe he deserved the very kindness he had always been willing to give to others. As winter faded slowly into early spring, and the world outside began waking up with pale sunlight and soft winds, Ethan realized that the season mirrored the quiet transformation happening within him, because just as the earth thawed from months of cold, his heart too was shedding layers of defenses he no longer needed. And though he still felt flashes of irritation that rose quicker than he liked, he found himself tackling them with a kind of steady patience he had never shown before. Something Lauren noticed every time he took a breath instead of snapping, every time he chose understanding over impulse. And their evenings gradually shifted from tense conversations to warm, thoughtful moments, where they talked honestly about their fears, dreams, and histories, slowly building a closeness neither of them had fully understood before. Meanwhile, Daniel watched this evolution with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Not because he expected perfection from Ethan, but because he saw his friend embracing a version of himself that had always been there beneath the anger. Gentle, loyal, fiercely protective, and capable of deep affection. And one night, after the three of them shared a simple dinner at Daniel's place, Ethan stepped outside to get some air and found himself staring up at the sky, taking in the countless stars shimmering beyond the rooftops. And in that peaceful stillness, he felt a sudden, overwhelming understanding wash over him, the realization that his entire life, he had mistaken emotional intensity for weakness, when in reality it had always been one of his greatest strengths. the reason he loved so deeply, cared so fiercely, stood up for others without hesitation. And as Lauren joined him, wrapping her arms around his from behind, he told her quietly that he had spent years believing no one truly saw him for who he was. But now he finally understood that people had always wanted to see him. They had simply been blinded by the walls he built out of fear, and she gently reminded him that love had never been his problem. It was the way he fought his emotions alone that kept him trapped. And now that he was learning to let others in, there was no reason for him to fear losing the people who genuinely cared. Because real love doesn't vanish when things get hard. It stays, it listens, it grows. And Ethan, feeling that truth settle deep in his chest, finally nodded. Accepting that he did not have to transform into someone else to be worthy of connection, he just had to trust that he was enough. And as Lauren leaned her head on his shoulder and Daniel A.'s laughter drifted from inside the house, Ethan felt a rare kind of peace forming in his heart, a peace that made him believe that for the first time in his life, he was not fighting against himself, but learning how to live with a heart that felt everything fiercely and honestly, exactly the way it was meant to. As the warmth of spring deepened and the soft green returned to the trees lining the quiet streets of their town, Ethan found himself walking through each day with a growing sense of balance that felt almost foreign to him. Because for years, he had believed that the intensity inside him was something he had to fight, something he had to suppress to avoid hurting the people he loved. Yet now he was learning that the real challenge wasn't to erase his fire, but to guide it, to let it burn with purpose instead of fear. And this new understanding changed his interactions in subtle yet powerful ways. Like the morning he received a frustrating message at work that once would have sent him into a spiral of anger. But instead of reacting immediately, he set his phone aside, closed his eyes, and reminded himself that he could choose his response rather than letting his emotions dictate it. And later that evening, when he told Lauren about it, she smiled with the kind of pride that warmed him all the way through, telling him that growth wasn't loud or dramatic. It was moments like that, quiet victories that proved he was reclaiming control over the parts of himself that had once controlled him. And Daniel echoed the same sentiment the next weekend, when they all met at a small lakeside park, where the breeze danced across the water and the air smelled faintly of pine. And as they sat beneath a tall oak tree sharing stories about their teenage years, Daniel pointed out that Ethan's strength was finally showing in the way it was always meant to, not as explosive reactions, but as steady leadership, honesty, and vulnerability, qualities that had always been overshadowed by his anger, but were now shining through like sunlight, breaking past old clouds. And Ethan felt these words settle deep inside him, not as compliments, but as affirmations of a path he was finally choosing to walk with intention. And as the afternoon stretched into golden hours, Lauren rested her head against his arm and told him that the most beautiful changes are the ones we don't even notice happening until someone we trust points them out, because transformation is not about becoming someone new, but becoming more of who we were always meant to be. And Ethan felt a quiet awe inside him as he realized how true that was. For the more he learned to understand his emotions, the more he recognized the tender heart hiding beneath years of defensiveness, a heart that had always cared too deeply, always loved too strongly, always feared loss too intensely. And now, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky glowed with shades of amber and rose, he understood that his anger had never made him unlovable. It had made him human, and the real strength was in learning to guide that intensity with love, honesty, and trust, not just for the sake of others, but for his own peace. And as he wrapped his arms gently around Lauren, hearing Daniel's easy laughter beside him, he felt a certainty he had never felt before, a certainty that he was finally stepping into the life, the relationships, and the emotional freedom he had always deserved. In the following weeks, Ethan's life began to feel like a gentle rhythm he hadn't experienced before. A rhythm where moments of challenge no longer threatened to overwhelm him, because he had learned that the fire within could be tempered by understanding, patience, and the willingness to trust not just others but himself. And he found that the more he allowed himself to feel fully, without fear or judgment, the lighter and freer he became. Which Lauren noticed in the small things, like the way he would laugh more openly during their walks through the neighborhood, The way he would pause to notice the little joys that had always existed, but that he had too often ignored while trapped in his emotional storms. And Daniel commented one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, that Ethan had grown into someone whose presence didn't just command attention, but invited connection. Someone who could love fiercely without scaring people away. Someone whose intensity was no longer a barrier, but a beacon. And for Ethan, hearing these words felt both strange and wonderful, because for so long he had believed his passionate nature would always isolate him. Yet now he saw that when guided with care and understanding, it drew people closer instead of pushing them away. And this realization inspired him to continue sharing his story in every way he could, writing not just about anger and fear, but about love, hope, resilience, and the importance of being true to oneself. And as his words reached strangers across the country, people who had suffered silently, people who felt misunderstood, people who carried the weight of emotions too heavy for others to understand, he received messages of gratitude, stories of healing, and even friendships he never expected. And with each response, he felt a growing sense of purpose, knowing that the very qualities that once made him feel isolated, his honesty, his deep care for others, and yes, even his fiery temperament, were now helping people recognize their own value, their own capacity to feel deeply without shame. And in that process, Ethan realized the final truth he had been seeking all along. That being human meant embracing every part of himself, even the parts that had once frightened him and others. And in doing so, he found not only peace, but a profound joy. Because for the first time, he understood that love, when tempered with self-awareness, patience, and honesty, could turn even the fiercest fire into a source of warmth, connection, and hope. And as he looked at Lauren, Emily, Daniel, and even his mother, watching her regain her strength, he understood that his journey had never been about eliminating anger, but about letting love and truth guide it. And that realization filled him with a calm, steady happiness unlike anything he had known before. A happiness born not from perfection, but from acceptance, growth, and the courage to show his heart exactly as it was meant to be seen. Over the next few months, Ethan's life settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that blended the challenges of the past with the promise of a future he was learning to embrace fully, because now he understood that his anger, honesty, and deep capacity to care were not flaws, but gifts, that, when guided by intention and empathy, could strengthen every relationship he valued. And he applied this understanding in every interaction, whether it was with his co-workers, his family, or his closest friends, and even strangers, who increasingly sought him out after reading his words online and hearing his story. And he realized that the boy who had once feared every misunderstanding, who had hidden behind spikes of frustration to protect his heart, was now a man who could confront emotions with grace, courage, and transparency. And this change allowed him to approach Emily, Lauren, Daniel, and his mother with a sense of peace he had never known, feeling capable of expressing not only his fears, but also his gratitude, his love, and his hopes for the future. And in doing so, he noticed that relationships that had once been strained or fragile now grew stronger, richer, and more resilient, because people could see the truth behind his actions, the purity of his intentions, and the depth of his affection. And he began to understand that communication, honesty, and vulnerability were far more powerful than suppression or avoidance. And he carried this lesson forward with every conversation, every gesture, every written word he shared. Realizing that even when challenges arose, as they inevitably did, they were no longer tests to survive alone, but opportunities to demonstrate the strength of love guided by awareness. And as spring blossomed into summer, Ethan reflected on his journey, seeing clearly how every moment of struggle, every misinterpreted outburst, every fear of losing those he loved had been necessary to teach him patience, self-awareness, and compassion. And he smiled quietly to himself, knowing that the fire within him was no longer a threat, but a source of energy, passion, and connection that he could share openly without fear. And that in sharing it, he could help others see that even the most intense emotions, when understood and expressed with honesty and care, could transform not just one life, but countless others, and with that knowledge settled deeply in his heart, Ethan finally felt a fullness, a quiet joy, and a clarity he had never known. understanding that he was no longer defined by moments of anger or fear, but by the love, courage, and truth he chose to live by every day. As the months passed, Ethan found himself navigating life with a kind of quiet confidence that had been absent for so many years. A confidence born not from arrogance, but from the deep understanding that he could feel intensely without being consumed, that he could speak the truth without causing harm, that he could care so deeply that fear no longer dictated his reactions. And this newfound balance shaped every aspect of his days, from work to family friendships and his relationship with Emily, who now saw the man he had always been, beneath the layers of defensiveness and frustration. A man capable of loving fiercely, but also of listening, of pausing, of letting others express themselves without judgment. And Daniel noticed the change too, watching Ethan offer guidance and support without the sharpness that had once defined him, now tempered by empathy and patience. And even his mother, Marilyn, who had once worried that his temperament would prevent him from forming lasting bonds, expressed pride and relief, acknowledging that Ethan had learned to channel the intensity of his heart into something constructive, nurturing, and profoundly human. And as Ethan continued writing his story, he realized it was no longer just about his personal journey, but about offering hope to anyone who had ever felt misunderstood, alone, or judged for feeling too much. And messages poured in from strangers who found solace in his words, some sharing their own experiences with misunderstood anger, some describing the relief of finally being seen for their true selves. And Ethan began to understand that his struggles had a purpose far greater than he could have imagined, that the very qualities that once isolated him were now tools for connection, healing, and empowerment. And in the quiet moments with Emily, as they walked through parks, shared meals, or simply sat together in silence, he felt a depth of love and gratitude that eclipsed any fear or frustration that had once controlled him. And he realized that the man he had become was capable of embracing all aspects of himself: the anger, the fear, the love, the honesty, and transforming them into strengths that nurtured relationships rather than strained them. And this understanding gave him a peace that was steady, enduring, and profoundly liberating, because he finally knew that being human meant feeling fully, expressing honestly, and loving without reservation. And as summer unfolded around them, Ethan could see the beauty in the world, in the people he cared for, and in the person he had worked so hard to become. And he understood that his journey was not defined by the moments of anger or fear, but by the courage, patience, and love he chose every single day. And in that realization, he found a sense of fulfillment that was both quiet and powerful. A reminder that even the deepest struggles can lead to transformation, healing, and a life lived fully, authentically, and bravely. As summer turned into early fall and the golden leaves began drifting softly to the ground, Ethan finally felt the full weight and beauty of everything he had experienced, because every challenge, every moment of fear, every misunderstood outburst had led him to this place of clarity, love, and self-awareness. And he realized that the fire he had once thought was dangerous, uncontrollable, and isolating had always been part of his strength, a flame that, when guided by honesty, patience, and compassion, could illuminate not only his path, but the paths of those around him. And Emily, walking beside him through the crisp autumn air, reached for his hand and smiled, her eyes reflecting the same quiet pride and affection that had supported him through every step of his journey. And he squeezed her hand, feeling a gratitude so deep it made his chest ache, knowing that their love had survived, because he had learned to channel the intensity of his heart into connection rather than conflict. And Daniel, joining them at a local cafe afterward, joked about how Ethan's angry phase was now just a story people would read about in awe rather than fear, and Ethan laughed, feeling the truth in it, because he knew that the boy who had once been ruled by fear and misinterpretation had grown into a man who could feel deeply, act thoughtfully, and love fully. And in the quiet evenings that followed, when he sat at his desk writing his story, reading the heartfelt messages of strangers who found hope and recognition in his words, he understood that his journey had a purpose far beyond personal healing. It was a testament to the power of self-awareness, the courage to confront one's emotions, and the strength found in vulnerability. And as the first snow of the season dusted the rooftops and the world seemed to slow into a peaceful hush, Ethan sat beside Emily, watching the snowflakes dance and reflecting on how far he had come, feeling an unshakable peace in knowing that he could face the future without fear of his emotions, that he could nurture the people he loved without letting past patterns define him, and that his life, filled with honesty, love, compassion, and controlled passion, was not only whole but deeply meaningful. A life that proved that even the most intense hearts, when guided by love and understanding, could transform challenges into connections, fears into courage, and anger into a profound source of warmth, insight, and hope. And in that moment, Ethan finally smiled without restraint, fully aware that he was living the life he had fought to create. A life of authenticity, empathy, and enduring love. Life is full of emotions, and sometimes the feelings we fear the most, anger, fear, sadness, are the very ones that show how deeply we care. What matters is not hiding them, but learning to understand them, guide them, and express them with honesty and love. Remember, being misunderstood doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Embrace your heart, trust yourself, and never be afraid to love fiercely, speak your truth, and grow through every challenge life gives you. Your emotions are not your enemy, they are your greatest strength if you learn to listen to them. If you like this story, make sure you subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share with your friends and family so you don't miss the next powerful story coming your way. Drop a heart in comment, like and subscribe my channel, and visit my channel for more interesting story videos.